I have already spent a lot of time talking about Solar Crown throughout its early betas, and many of you have also already tried out at least one of the playtests or demos. So in this review, I'm still going to hit on my major points: the physics and handling, car list, performance and visuals, gameplay loop and multiplayer, and the map itself, but with an emphasis on what has changed and what has stayed the same from the demos. And as always, the most important part of a racing game for me is how it handles. You can't have a fun driving game if the cars aren't fun to drive. After my time in the PC demo, I gave Solar Crown a rough 7 out of 10 when it came to non-sim racing game handling. I found it to be better than some alternatives, but not without its faults, particularly in the sim half of Simcade handling. I mentioned that the driving didn't feel cohesive, and that it had some elements that were very arcadey, some that felt more realistic, and some that just felt bad. After the demo ended, the developers did further refine the handling, and I am quite pleased with the result. They took a handling model that was rough and polished it into something that I do thoroughly enjoy. Loss of grip, especially in rear-wheel drive vehicles, now happens much smoother, and it's easier to countersteer and correct as well. Snap oversteer has been heavily reduced, and you can actually feel out the grip limit and slip angle of your car in a corner. Braking and throttle management feel pretty good as well, and drifting feels more natural with better momentum, weight shift, and grip levels. Off-roading has improved too, although I do still think the gravel and dirt surfaces could use some tuning, but it's still an overall enjoyable experience. TDU 1 and especially 2 were not known for their good handling, and that dragged the whole experience down, because it wasn't as fun to drive those endless island roads when the driving wasn't that good. Finally though, I have a TDU game that's just plain fun to drive. And even though this is much more of a controller game for me, the handling is still fun on a wheel. I primarily used the Moza R3 that I still have plugged in from my review a little bit ago, and I know that because I'm talking about wheels, people are going to ask about the wheel animation, and yeah, it's quite bad, but for whatever it's worth to you, they did say it's something they're planning to improve sometime down the line. That said, again, I played almost entirely on controller, and this finally feels like the handling model that they were trying to achieve the whole time. I don't think it's going to perfectly satisfy everyone. Like most Simcade models, you kinda either love it or hate it, and I don't think it's perfect either. Jumps and collisions can behave strangely. I still feel like the handbrake is an overly helpful tool to rotate the car in tighter corners, and in many cases, wall riding or tapping are still very viable. But from a casual gameplay perspective, this is easily one of the more fun handling models for an open world racing game that I've ever experienced. And I'm happy that KT Racing kept working on it throughout development. And I do want to quickly bring up the custom driving modes as well that we didn't have access to in the demos. These were talked about, but for some reason I don't think ever actually shown in any marketing. And I don't understand why. This is a great feature. As you level up, you'll unlock preset modes for each car in order to better tailor it to some different environments, but once you hit level 20, you can create your own custom modes. And this is just a fully featured tuning menu, very similar to what you get in the Horizon games. It's also done in a kind of neat way where you can choose exactly how detailed you want to get. If you don't want to dive into each detailed setting, you can just mix and match between any of these presets and then see what's changing in the tune. Then if you do want to make more specific adjustments to even just one or two areas, you simply make your own edits where you need them. It might be a bit overwhelming at first, but this is a very powerful tool that deserves to be shown off. Now, Solar Crown provides you with just over 100 cars to drive around in on Hong Kong Island, and it doesn't feel like enough. That's not because of the number, there is just a lack of variety in Solar Crown's car list, with the vast majority of offerings being high-end European exotics from around the 2010s. Fitting enough for a TDU game, but as an example, there are only 2 Japanese sports cars, a 370Z and a GTR. No Honda, no Toyota, no Subaru or Mitsubishi, no Lexus or Acura, no Mazda, barely anything at all from the Japanese market. And the American roster is pretty limited as well, with just a handful of Fords and a couple of Dodges and Chevys, totaling about 1/10 of the entire car list. Again, don't get me wrong, it's kind of fitting for a TDU game to lean into the luxury European market, but they really couldn't fit in an LFA or NSX there, maybe a Celine or something. I mean, there are plenty of other American or Japanese supercars that would fit the bill. This also means that a lot of dealerships in the game just have multiple repeats of the same few cars. This Asian dealership is particularly sad with only 3 offerings in the whole place. The lack of variety isn't helped either by the lack of customization. Again, another thing TDU is not known for, but your ability to personalize each of your cars is much more limited than I expected. You do have a full paint and livery booth and can tint windows and change interior trim, but I was expecting far more aftermarket wheels on launch. Instead, we just have what the demo offered, a couple of stock options for many cars, and then about 20 to 25 aftermarket rims. The cars do feel great to drive, and by and large, they sound great too, with nice cold startup sounds and shifting noises, but there just isn't quite enough variety and customization among the roster to satisfy a player like myself. And with that, it's time to talk about how the game looks and runs. I said in my earlier videos that yes, the demos ran poorly, but I had some confidence that it would improve for launch, and that I'd be able to play at max settings on my ultra-wide at 60 FPS. I was wrong. Unfortunately, the game is still very hard to run on PC. I'll put my own specs up on screen, but even the official recommended hardware asks for a 2080 and 11700K just to hit 60 FPS at 1080p at medium settings with DLSS or FSR upscaling. That's wild. On my hardware, I can run the game at 1440/60 at 16:9 on high or max settings without DLSS or frame gen, but that's on a 4080 Super. It's also worth mentioning that the frame gen doesn't work well for me and leads to tons of visual artifacting, especially with HUD elements or in the menus. There are a lot of other visual bugs too, like low-res reflections, bad pop-in and level of detail, some major lighting issues, or this comically large shadow under most of my cars that you'll see throughout this whole video. On a more positive note, the game never crashed for me, and it doesn't stutter or freeze, it just demands high-end hardware to run at 60 FPS. With performance like this, a large chunk of the PC market is going to feel alienated, and from what I've seen in other reviews and gameplay footage, performance does also suffer on consoles as well, with subpar visuals and occasional frame drops on both Xbox and PS5. Also, I did install Solar Crown on my Steam Deck, and it just didn't run at all, so it seems like Steam Deck players are also out of luck for now too. I really hope performance and optimization are something that the team continues to work heavily on, because Solar Crown can look very nice, and there are certainly some details I appreciate, like the dense foliage and cities, very pretty lighting and skyboxes in the morning or evening, and high texture detail. But Solar Crown's requirements are just too high for the average PC player to be able to experience the game at its best, and it looks like console players are getting a suboptimal experience as well. With that though, it's time to talk about the gameplay. There is an enjoyable game here, but don't expect the varied gameplay and lifestyle elements of TDU 1 and 2, and certainly don't expect an MMO. This is a system and region-locked game with a max group size of 4 players and seemingly a max lobby size of 8. There are larger meta goals with respect to things like the clan system and server-wide challenges, but you will never be playing with more than 7 other people at the same time that are also on your system and in your region. There's no houses or customization to the apartments, although they say they're thinking about housing for the future. There's no mission events outside of just racing. There's no clothing stores in the world, no police system, and no casino yet. That's been slated for summer of next year. So people expecting a modern, direct sequel to TDU 2 will be disappointed. I've still been having fun with Solar Crown, it's just not what I had hoped for in a luxury lifestyle driving MMO. This feels much more like a Horizon game with progression instead of the next Test Drive Unlimited. With some time and more updates though, hopefully it can grow into that role a bit more. That said, the progression itself has felt mostly well balanced to me. Throughout the first 20 or so hours, I never felt like I was being bombarded with too much to keep track of, or scraping by with too little to do. But the pacing definitely does slow down as you increase in rank. And the same goes for income. The pacing during the early leveling is right where I think it should be. I always made enough money to buy what I needed and had some fun experimenting with a couple of other builds here and there. But each car and upgrade still felt like a meaningful purchase that I had to consider seriously, with most high-end cars being far out of reach in the early game. When it came time to buy my first car over 1 million credits, I had to go around to all the dealerships, test drive their various offerings, and think about which car would be the best fit for me. And that is a very good and very TDU feeling. However, income does slow down over time and pushes you towards PvP and maybe later even the battle pass they have planned. In the early to mid game, you make a lot of extra money and experience from exploring and finding collectibles, completing speed traps, and doing challenges or getting progression bonuses. But those are all one-time rewards. You can, of course, rerun races, but the more you repeat one race, the less it pays out. So in the late game, once many of the non-repeatable income and experience sources start to dry up, the pacing slows down significantly. Obviously though, Solar Crown has been really pushing the whole live service clan versus clan PvP system, but currently this is pretty light on content and rewards. The whole clan mechanic does not offer a ton of gameplay or major income, but as a sort of background system, it does help provide more substance to everything and can help you decide what you want to do when you log in. There is also plenty of exploration to be had in the game world, with lots of collectibles and hidden wrecks scattered throughout the map, and there are tons and tons of race layouts with a bit of event variety, ranging from solo time trials to domination style races. And you will keep unlocking new cars, upgrades, clan battles, and other features as you level up, so there is always something new around the corner while you're progressing through the game. Ultimately, in Solar Crown, while there isn't a huge variety of things to do, and the pacing slows to a crawl in the late game, there was enough to keep me entertained throughout much of the leveling process, and it just feels nice to play a racing game with some real progression and long-term goals to shoot for. Time will tell if the late game income and live service features keep things moving forward, but for now, I do still think there's a solid 30 or so hours worth of enjoyable solo content before you really start to hit that progression wall. You don't need to wait out long timers anymore in order to start races, it just auto-populates with AI if you click through, and for most people that's what they're going to do instead of waiting possibly minutes for the race to fill with real people. And and many of the clan goals don't require you to actively play with others, but it's absolutely worth noting that some events and features do require other real players in your lobby. This is an always online game, and that comes with all the downsides attached to that, but you can still enjoy it as a solo player. It's just unfortunate that a franchise that used to be a leader in multiplayer features and innovation is now seemingly lagging far behind. But let's talk now about the map. Hong Kong Island recreated in 1:1 scale. This is a map similar in size to Motorfest, Unbound, or Horizon, but it is much more dense than really all of its competitors, making the map feel decently large, although obviously not even close to the size of TDU 1 or 2. This is a good map, it's just hard to ignore the obvious downgrade in size from the last two games. There are tons of great roads with tons of cool little places to explore, some of them very well hidden, and like I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of different collectibles to find around the map, including 28 total wreck parts, making exploration meaningful. Traffic density is fine. I think some people might find it to be a bit light, and many of the districts do feel like they blend together a bit, as a lot of the buildings, foliage, and other props are reused quite heavily throughout the whole map. So you don't experience a lot of significant landscape or architecture changes as you drive from one end of the game world to the other. My real issue with the map though, which is something I brought up in earlier videos, is that it feels devoid of life. This is mostly for two reasons. One being the major lack of pedestrians. There are a few people scattered around the map, but they just stand there very out of the way, and you usually don't even notice them. And I understand that there are major hurdles to overcome with the addition of pedestrian traffic, both from a dev time and budget standpoint, performance standpoint, and age rating standpoint. But it's just hard to shake the feeling that the city feels empty. The other major problem is that the city sounds empty. I'm gonna let you just listen to the ambient audio without music in a couple of places so you can hear just how quiet everything is. As you can tell, the lack of lively audio makes the world feel a bit lonely, and this is combined with somewhat light traffic and very sparse pedestrians, as well as very stiff voice acting and the lack of things like fun, campy radio hosts, and the fact that the world isn't even populated with that many real players. The core map layout and design does feel good to me, and it's fun to drive around and explore in. But I can just never shake off that eerily empty feeling. So to summarize, Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown, at its core, is an enjoyable game, with lots of exploration and great roads that are fun to drive due to the game's refined simcade handling. It has some real progression that gives you long-term stretch goals to shoot for, and multiple paths to follow. And those things alone are worth commending. So many other games these days seem to struggle with one or more of those areas. And it's nice to just have a game that's fun to cruise around the map in and fun to buy cars in. However, I don't feel like Solar Crown lives up to the innovation of its predecessors, and whether it's due to the quiet cities, strangely clinical and futuristic aesthetic, or the absence of memorable radio stations, Solar Crown lacks a certain energy and liveliness that the previous games had. Solar Crown feels a bit cold and hollow, and the multiplayer features aren't going to help that. Strong communities and meaningful player interaction are often what keep games like this alive, but Solar Crown is going to struggle to build that with its player base split across consoles and regions. And the limited group and lobby size and lack of any user-generated content, trading, or markets are going to make it harder for any dedicated player communities to emerge. I think there is a future for Solar Crown. The game is fun to play at its core, and the roadmap does look relatively promising. But the always online requirements and rough performance and inconsistent visuals on both PC and console are enough to turn away a huge chunk of players. And even for those willing to look past those things, as it stands right now, I'm not sure there's enough in the late game to keep people playing for the long term. If you're looking for a new world to cruise around in, or something to pull you away from your current favorite racing game for a while, then Solar Crown will do that, and you'll likely have fun with it. But the current open world racing favorites are not going to be dethroned by the long-awaited return of Test Drive Unlimited.